Light during Barack Hoover Obama's summer of recovery. As we plow on through the month of August, remember the summer of recovery will not end until September 20th or 21st, and then I don't know what Barack Hoover Obama is going to call it next. What catchy name they'll come up with for the fall. Is this finally the economic collapse? Fortune magazine, Keith McCullough. It's depressing, folks. All the financial wizards are saying the Fed's out of bullets, bought up some more debt, didn't inspire any confidence. For all Obama has done, there's still this great unknown. Businesses have no clue yet what the tax structure is going to be come January. All this talk about extending the Bush tax cuts or sunsetting them for some, if not everybody, or keeping them for the rich, but letting them continue for everybody else. Nobody knows. People are still trying to get their arms around healthcare costs, business-wise, what that's going to do. Now, you can look to the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, or you can look to the regime, try to get all these positive stories, which they're really not known for. But until there is some certitude to what the future holds, and most people think they know it, it's not good, you're not going to have expansion. You're not going to have private sector growth. I remember January 16th of 2009 is when I first said, I hope he fails. And what I meant by that, I hope he fails getting health care implemented. I hope he fails with this massive stimulus plan. I hope he fails implementing socialist liberal policies. In that sense, he's not failed. He's gotten what he wanted. What's happened is the country is failing as a result, which is what I knew would happen, which is what I feared would happen. And now here we are with Fortune magazine, the Great Depression, Wall Street 1987, Japan 1997. Points of economic collapse are generally crystal clear in the rearview mirror. Professional politicians in Japan have been telling stories for 20 years as to why they can prevent economic stagnation. Now, despite the many differences between Japan and the United States, there is one similarity that continues to matter most in the risk management model that my colleagues and I use at Hedgeye, our research firm: debt as a percentage of GDP. Now that the U.S. can't cut interest rates any lower, the only option left on the table is what the Fed just announced it's going to start doing: buying Treasury debt. And that could lead the country to the brink of collapse, because that's the end of the bullets. According to economists Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff, whose views we share, crossing the 90% debt GDP threshold is the equivalent of crossing the proverbial Rubicon of economic growth. It's a point from which it's almost impossible to return. Markets trade on expectations. Yesterday's zigzag in the S&P 500 was unlike most sleepy August trading days in America. That's because the government is good crowd leaked word that this second round of quantitative easing, and that Ben Bernanke was going to respond to our buy and hope begging, and that's buying up treasuries and mortgage debt and so on and so on. So now what? With 40.8 million Americans on food stamps, a record high, and 45% of the unemployed having been seeking employment for 27 weeks or more, another record high. What's left if or when the Fed's actions don't kickstart GDP growth? Folks, there's nothing out there that's going to kickstart GDP growth. What this buying of treasury bills, buying up debt, is supposed to inspire Wall Street and others to go borrow themselves. That the debt's being purchased, it's being guaranteed, nothing better than U.S. treasuries, but it isn't working. And the reason it isn't working, and the reason it won't work, is because of what I just talked about, the uncertainties that start in 2011. Right now, we know what some certainties are. Right now, if things don't change, a massive tax increase hits, because some tax cuts sunset. People want to argue about the terminology. No, Russia's not a tax increase. They're just ending some taxing. The practical effect is less disposable income in the private sector. I don't care what you tax increase, tax cut, whatever you want to call it. January 2011, there is going to be less money in the private sector. More money is going to be going to government. There's a story in the Stack today. A bunch of economists have come out and said, we cannot extend tax cuts for the rich. We just can't do it. So I read further into the story for why. Why can't we extend tax cuts for the rich? You know why? Because it will cost the Treasury $36 billion a year. Now stop and think about this. It will cost the Treasury $36 billion a year. And that's why we cannot extend tax cuts for the rich. So they're saying we need that $36 billion taken away from the millionaires and the well-to-do, and we need to put that in control of the government. Now, how does that help us? The government just spent $26 billion that it doesn't have to shore up the pensions and retirement funds and health care of teachers, on top of a $1 trillion porculus bill a couple years ago, a year and a half ago. And yet, keeping $36 billion in the private sector, we can't have that. That will destroy the country because the government's not going to get its hands on that $36 billion. Everything's out of whack here. We've already robbed the private sector. This regime has already waged war on the private sector, has already depleted the amount of capital in the private sector. There will be no GDP growth whatsoever if the only growth is in government, because they don't make anything. All they do is redistribute and destroy wealth. They do not create wealth. Well, even that's not so much true anymore. I mean, if you work in the right places in government, you will get rich. But it's not moral, and it's not just. Stop and think of this, though. There is an activist move to prevent these tax cuts from continuing, because it'll cost the precious government $36 billion. The government, why? We can't have that. The government, we starve $36 billion. And they're positioning it by saying, well, it's either that or leave that money in the hands of millionaires. And we're supposed to think millionaires. Ooh, yuck. Yeah, we hate millionaires. Well, given where we are right now, who'd you rather have that money? The wealthy who are going to spend it in the private sector, called stimulus, maybe hire people, whatever they do with it, even if they bank it, it's going to employ people. Or would you have that money in the hands of people who are already making this country worthless, whose policies are already causing greater harm and more damage? Back to this piece in Fortune magazine. Before the fiat fools, that's Hedgeye's name for actors and bankers who have placed their hopes of economic recovery in printing endless supplies of new money. Before the fiat fools run out campaigning for QE3, maybe they should analyze some real-time market results to yesterday's announcement of QE2, which is buying up the debt, and take a look at what happened to the stock market. It didn't work. Normally, the market opens down. By noon, it starts to tick back up. It didn't. It continued to fall, finishing down 265 or something yesterday. Today, it's also down. So what Bernanke did yesterday did not work. And they're running out of bullets. Now, the evidence, I think, is pretty clear. After a year and a half of stimulus here and bailout there and stimulus over there, can we conclude it doesn't work? We've been told how many times we're back from the brink. We've been told how many times it would have been much worse if we hadn't done what we're doing. How can it get any worse? It has gotten worse ever since this regime assumed office. Now, we're coming up on 2 years. 2 years. And this regime is going to continue to try to blame Bush. That's the only option they have left. And yet, on the ground, reality is that their way of stimulating growing economic activity does not work. We don't even need to rely just on these 18 months. There is enough world history to show that command and control economies do not grow.